Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I'm with my great friend, Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hi, everybody. This is Chen. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and late in medieval China. It's a great honor to be with you today. Let's continue our conversation. Around.
Yes. So, very short summary of what we have been doing and why we have been doing this. And then we can jump into the conversation that we want to pursue today. So, our emphasis in Versucha project has shifted towards the concept of human nature. Um, Due to our dissatisfaction with our dive into Hegel's philosophy and seeing that although a lot of things are in fluctuation, a lot of mentioning of history and change and transformation are present in Hegel's work, the concept of human nature seems to be kind of outside that world. And that was not definitely exclusive to Hegel. In fact, we thought Hegel could save us from that kind of fixated structure that other philosophers and thinkers have presented. But we were disappointed by that feature of Hegel's philosophy. And we also thought that the concept of human nature, by its transdisciplinary nature, that it kind of covers and pokes and is presupposed by all sorts of disciplines of the human sciences and even natural sciences, it's going to be a great category to focus on for our project, which is by nature challenging the boundaries between academic disciplines in our time. In our efforts to pursue this project, we have started with the concept of human nature in the context of, or in response, in conversation with the discoveries of the biological sciences in the 19th and 20th century. Because one of the main features that we have seen is that prior to the 19th century, one of the main features of accounts of human nature is uh, based on the idea that the species have a given essence, and they have a given essence, and that the essence is developed in certain ways, it's uh, articulated in certain ways, but the essence is just in place. Now, with the evolutionary biology, we are in a different world. There doesn't seem to be a room for any essence. Everything is in flux. Everything wasn't there at some point, and everything is in perpetual susceptibility of to change. Our question is, in the light of these discoveries, is there any way to think about human nature in any meaningful way? Or we should throw away the concept of human nature and just find a new way to understand ourselves that doesn't have that conceptual baggage. In doing so, we have talked about a couple of approaches, and a lot of the things that we have talked about have been through the lens of one of the most prominent philosophers of biology of our time, Grant Ramsey. So, Trent, why don't you give us a little bit of a summary of who Grant Ramsey is, and then we can kind of delve into his ideas and how it connects to what we're going to do today.
Yeah. It's kind of really a moment of nostalgia because in our pre-Hegel period, we always start uh, introducing a book with a very, very short biographical sketch, and we kind of forgot the need of doing so during our long self-inflicted torture or reading Hegel. But I think it's a great time to come back to that habit because it will help us. And I personally, I think it helps me to contextualize the book I read written by Graham Ramsey. Graham Ramsey is a very interesting researcher. He's based in Brussels. No, not Brussels. What I'm talking about, Belgium,
Belgium.
at the Institute of Philosophy at the KU Leuven, and his research has essentially three pillars, I would say. One is like more in the philosophy side, namely the conceptual foundations of evolutionary theory. Second one is more on like human as well as other non-human animals, behaviors, recognizing emotions. It's more kind of observing and descriptive, that kind of empirical studies. The third one is more like methodological. He's trying to devise a certain automated method of mining contemporary, really vast corpus of scientific literature. So what, like, I of course haven't read his whole like publication. But what is really interesting is that his strength is really to accommodate very, very large amount of data and to provide a theory and a method that can recognize huge patterns. But the downside is also perhaps or the natural trade-off for this is you don't really see case by case detailed interpretation and the connection across time, but rather it's more making sense of a contingent mess at a given time. So I think that really helps me to kind of contextualize his trait cluster theory. So speaking of which, will you take us perhaps to briefly review what that trait cluster account is about, provided by Ramsey?
Yes. Yeah, so what Ramsey does in this kind of like intersection between biology and philosophy is to try to find a way to revive the concept of human nature, or maybe reinterpret it in the way that it can stay alive in the post-Darwinian world. And the way he goes about this is to decouple nature from essence. So for Ramsey, human beings do not have any essences, but they have natures. And he thinks he's not alone in this camp of people that think about human nature in this way. But he has a specific approach that he calls a trait cluster account. There are other variations of it that you can, if you listen to our past episodes, you can get a detailed account of it. But basically, what Ramsey is interested is that there are traits, realized and unrealized traits, at any given time for our species. And these traits are not just a basket that we just like, it's not a bin of traits. They are causally connected and causally sustained. And these causally sustained relations between the realized and unrealized traits, meaning potential traits, and probability of their flexibility at a given time is what constitutes human nature. So for Ramsey, trait is an important concept. Causal connections, causal networks between traits are important. So it's not just an accident that, having a certain chromosome only allows for like certain, bonus structure of an organism, right? Or reduces the probability of the bonus structure being vastly just different. This means that Ramsey's account, although interesting enough, it's not clearly articulated as such, has a lot of like statistical elements, but a statistical not in the sense of a statistical frequency, but in terms of the probability of flexibility of different traits. I mentioned that because one of the interesting features of Ramsey's account is that the statistical frequency is a terrible way to approach the concept of human nature, because there are some traits in humanity and other animals that are very rare statistically, but they play a very important role in a causal link between the individuals within individual members of the species. This aspect of Ramsey is actually something that becomes in some ways a problem for Ramsey's account, as we discussed in our criticism of Ramsey, because we identified a number of issues with Ramsey, but one of the problems that we had was this idea of a trait, and how like traits, like thinking about human nature in the language of traits, could actually do the same kind of a decontextualized, cause the same kind of decontextualized issue that we face with a statistical frequency kind of approach, right? So when we think about the statistical frequency, our problem is that, okay, the queen bee is not statistically frequent in a bee colony, but it's very important in understanding what bees are, right? The bee nature, right? We have the same problem with the concept of trait itself, and the way that the causal links between traits are understood by Ramsey, how that could be a problem. Another problem that we have is that, and we have talked about this extensively, is that although Ramsey is interested in not having a reductionistic account when it comes to the relation between nature and culture, meaning that he doesn't think that uh, there is this level of pure nature as the core of humanity, that like culture is not now just set on top of it. His understanding of the relationship between the two proves to be problematic in our eyes, especially when he thinks that human beings' self-conception of themselves has nothing to do with what human nature actually is. So when he starts to analyze the concept of human nature, he wants to say that yeah, we have theories of human nature, we have ways to understand human nature, we have certain beliefs about human nature, but none of those matter. If you want to know what human nature is, we need to kind of detach ourselves with these kind of like cultural mystifications and get to the truth of what human nature is. And that's just an example of like a place that we think Ramsey might be getting things a little bit wrong. Um, there are some other issues, like the issues that I mentioned, um, also including the point that in some ways we find Ramsey's account not evolutionary enough, and that is going to become clear when we talk about the figures that we're going to talk about in this episode. But the problem of trait as a given unit, the difference between nature and culture, and the problem with the evolutionary aspect of Ramsey's account are going to be the stuff that we're going to talk about through the figures that we introduce in this section and in this conversation. Just to give it like as like a disclaimer, there are issues with Ramsey that we think the people that we're going to introduce to you now do not solve in any meaningful way either. And maybe the point about speciation and like a more philosophically robust uh, understanding of the concept of causality could be among those. And we will revisit those topics because we find them very, very useful. Um, the figures that we're going to talk about today in this session, in this conversation, and the next conversation, um, uh, have a similar attitudes to Ramsey, but they introduce concepts or attitudes that we think are going to be useful in modifying Ramsey's account. So our purpose here to modify Ramsey's account based on the insights from um, two lines of thinking. One is the processional approach of John Dupré, and the other one is Griffiths and Stutz's developmental systems approach that we think could solve some of the issues that we faced while discussing Ramsey. So, Trent, why don't you introduce us a little bit to John Dupré, and then we can have a conversation and see how he can contribute to this discussion.
Yeah, totally. Yes, first of all, thanks for summarizing that. I think one of our primary frustration with Ramsey's account is kind of his model assumes we can mysteriously recognize traits out of all the continuum, and I think we draw the parallel between that approach with symbolic communication approach in cultural anthropology. Traits for him is very like Clifford Geertz's concept of text, but when talking about connections, the causally constrained connections among traits, he didn't really specify how the context of his text. So, dear listeners, our new figures introduced in this episode and in the future conversation, like John Dupré or Griffith, are taking issue with primarily this lack, like, or how do we make sense of text without thinking about the context? They will say probably no. We need to think about the context as well as text. So much for that. Let's briefly talk about who John Dupré is. He's also again very interesting. Sort of a thinker with a very unique portfolio, so to speak. It's a British philosopher of science, and director of the Center for the Study of Life Sciences and professor at the University of Exeter. Very interesting, he belongs to the so-called Stanford School of Philosophy of Science, which they have essentially two main things. One is anti-reductionism. Second is how to put it? Um, process with a very strong emphasis on process. Or so I think it won't be very controversial to call it the deconstructionism. So the anti-reductionism is saying that even though different disciplines of science um, provide a different robust way of constructing knowledge, and each way somehow bridges the scientific discussion with the causality out there. So it's kind of affirming scientific realism. However, they're maintaining that these plural ways to approach the reality and constructing knowledge do not necessarily merge into a unified whole. So we don't have like universal law of like science which holds true in every different approaches. So it's kind of a pluralism in its anti-reductionism. The second one is the emphasis on process that they reflected on like research on science and emphasized it's a very complicated social and cultural process that it's not the way scientists behave and like communicate are not neutral in the sense that it won't influence their argument and fundamental ontological or methodological conclusions. So I think both would manifest in his approach towards human nature in terms of emphasis of the process as well as of plurality, plasticity. So with that said, would you please introduce us briefly to like his overarching account, what like human nature is according to John Dupré?
Yes, thanks for that summary. That's very helpful, and I think that point about the Stanford School of Philosophy of Science and this kind of anti-reductionist, non-unifying understanding of disciplines, which I agree with you. There are at least similarities between their approach and deconstructionist. I think it's a very important parallel, and I think we're going to go back to that world when we talk about that kind of like, you know, terrain of inference or like the causal planes that may not be interconnected. Our emphasis here, though, is about another layer of Dupré's approach, and then that approach is about his emphasis on the concept of process. And Ramsey treats this, and we have talked about this briefly when we were talking about Ramsey's criticism of his like competitors. But even then, we were not fully satisfied with Ramsey's criticism. So just to kind of briefly mention this point, and what Dupré is interested in is that when we're thinking about entities in nature, we are better off to think of them as processes. And when we think about them as processes, then when we think about their nature, we will have a different kind of a figure background reversal kind of a thing was going to happen. We're going to be like emphasizing on something that we usually don't emphasize. For Dupré, that's about identity. That when we think about substances, we seem to kind of like expect identity through time. When we talk about processes, we seem to be centralizing change. For someone like Ramsey, like this is more about semantics, like just like, you can take anything as a process or a substance. But I think that criticism is unjust to what Dupré is trying to say, because Dupré is understanding that we can call something substance within a process. His point is that if we think about process, then we can understand nature of biological events more accurately than when we think about them as substances. Now, as I said, one of the main features is that the processes centralizes change, not identity. Even if that change, like a thunderstorm, it still has an identity, right? When we think about a weather event like a hurricane as something that is constantly changing and like it has features that are rapidly changing based on myriad of like factors, we still recognize some form of identity, but we don't think about this identity as some sort of a core that doesn't change or like that we need to make sense of that identity. It's a different approach to identity. Maybe one of the most important things for Dupré is that when we emphasize on processes, not only we are not thinking about um, identities as this kind of rigid, stable, like being of like traits or features, but we also can like bring to light the developmental regimes that living being um, not only are part of, but also create for themselves. And we're going to unpack that in a second. For Dupré, when we're thinking about a biological entity, we will lose track of what it means to that biological entity if we don't understand what kind of developmental processes that entity is part of, not just as a recipient, but also as a creator. Um, these developmental regimes, then, for someone like Dupré, make room for understanding the context of traits and how they fit into different stages of life cycles. So remember that one of our main issues with the trait talk in Ramsey is that traits seem to be like these kind of free-floating items in the room that are kind of linked to each other, but not linked as part of a process, linked more so that like if you smoke, you die, you have higher chance for lung cancer, like linked in that kind of a one-way one one kind of like a bonding element, which might not be what Ramsey has in mind, but that's what is implied by his account. What Dupré is emphasizing is that these developmental systems where biological entities find themselves in or are creators of are pivotal in understanding what they are as those entities. So he writes, any organism lies at the intersection of a very large number of subordinate processes that together maintain its short-term stability and a long-term developmental trajectory, right? So for Dupré, we need to kind of see this, not just the what makes something static, like the homeostatic traits, but what kind of like doors are open, what direction something is going, right? And if you have like a snapshot of an entity, there is a danger that you're going to lose track of that path, right? If you're taking a photo of someone that is somewhere, yeah, maybe you can look at that photograph and like look at like what traits are existing in that photograph, but you're not probably going to see where this is going, how this is unfolding, and what is making it unfolding this way rather than this other way, right? So the homeoretic processes that uh, Dupré is interested in are the kind of processes that determine the developmental trajectory. They don't stabilize. They say this is how things are going to unfold, right? Just like a life cycle at a very basic natural sense that works. I think Dupré's issue or taking issue with Ramsey from the perspective of Dupré is that process is not just arbitrary thing that, oh, anything could be the substance or process. Process is to bring to the foreground that the traits have no context unless the developmental system that they're a part of is introduced to the picture, right? And when we understand this homeoretic processes, then we can talk about human nature in the form of human process. So the same code ends this way. Humans are distinguished by a particular species-specific set of homeoretic processes, and the typically reproduced stages thus generated constitutes the nature of the human process slash nature. So the concept of process for, in a broad sense, process metaphysics for Dupré is not just an issue of semantics that we can say, oh, let's go talk about substance, but it is a necessary condition for bringing forward the developmental trajectories that biological entities are part of, which Dupré thinks without that, we are blind in our understanding of any species nature, including human nature.
Yes,
Trent?
that's really, really helpful. The stuff you summarize is extremely complex. So I'm impressed you're able to summarize it within a few minutes. I think the couple of terms I want to perhaps unpack here because they are so uncommon, and we just, if you're just a humanistic scholar, just don't read like homostasis or rhesus. For lay people like me who might be listening, I want to introduce, highlight perhaps a couple of things, reiterate what you just introduced. Dupré is really interested in the concept of stability, but he does not understand stability as kind of fixed structure or like a fixed correlation. But instead, that's why he differentiates the two types of reaching kind of equilibrium or stable um, form of life. One is called a homeostasis. In Greek means the same standing or same structure, basically. So if you think about, say, maybe a house, inside there's like different furniture, and if everything stayed the same, that would be homeostasis. But the other type of stability construction is called a homeoresis, and homeos is the same, and the resis means flow, or so think about a river. Like every molecule of water is like constantly changing, going any direction, but the flow of the water is not random. It runs down toward, like, because for gravity and many other factors, and somehow there's a stable structure, and it creates an environment that it allows like water species to flourish in the same river. So identity is made primarily through change. That is the processes argument or system theory, trying to emphasize that to have identity, to have like stability across time, you don't need to have the presence of the same set of features or so-called traits that at all time, but rather you need is precisely what you emphasize, that a long-term developmental trajectory that allows individual or species at a collective level that live and flourish and survive in this developmental environment. So with that said, I think what you just mentioned could be perfectly fit into a parable. I will introduce that after you take us through the how this Dupré's idea could enrich or perhaps problematize our cluster a theory of traits introduced by Ramsey. Will you take us?
Yes, I think the point of introduction is to kind of like, or the purpose of like kind of like putting everything together is to kind of like a little bit unpack this idea of developmental trajectory better, so that we can kind of understand why it is a significant part of understanding of uh, something like human nature for Dupré and the processual approach. And I think the way to go about this and seeing the merit of the account requires us to think and talk a little bit about evolutionary psychology. And Dupré also in his papers talks about that, and We have encountered this in his writing as well. Like this is not like this competition between the processual approach to human nature and evolutionary psychology's approach to human nature is not something that we are introducing, but Dupré himself introduces it. And of course, evolutionary psychology, sorry, has a lot of like different like schools of thought and interpretations. But the idea here that is important in evolutionary psychology, as Dupré understands it, is that for Dupré, evolutionary psychology thinks that the traits that have been developed in humanity, behavior, motivations, etc., is caused by evolutionary pressures. And you can take different cultural elements, different like human cultures, different individuals, and explain their behavior based on the evolutionary core that is behind that behavior, right? So there is going to be some form of core explanatory uh, system of knowledge that every other human activity can be understood within that framework. And of course, like, not of course, but I think it's not very common to like think about someone like Freud as an evolutionary psychologist. But definitely there's an element in someone like Freud, a Freudian approach to human psyche that resembles this attitude, which we might be helpful to introduce him in here, which is that there is for someone like Freud, like there are different cultures, there are different civilizations, there are different expressions of hierarchy and power and all of that. But in some ways, at the core of that, where we kind of like take away all these kind of veneer and all these kind of like um, uh, a structure that is on top, there is a core, and that core explains human behavior. It's the ultimate points of explanation that, of course, for Freud, about sexual trauma and suppression and um, things along those lines. Uh, or when we think about like uh, like even like Marx, like for a different like line of thought, there is that kind of a core that explains behavior and explains why and how systems emerge. And we can go to that economic level. We can look at humanity from that perspective. It is the basis of what we are, and the rest, to an extent, is just like different variations, different expressions. Um, and even like Hegel that we talked about, he thinks about like reason is this kind of a core, and then you go to different cultures and they are like different expressions of the same thing, but it's the same core. And I think the way that Dupré introduces evolutionary psychology is very much like that. That evolutionary psychology thinks that there are these kind of like core explanations of human behavior and human traits that all could be traced back to some fixed feature, or if not fixed, merely evolutionary, uh, evolutionarily developed uh, traits of humanity. Um, and Dupré thinks that's not accurate. Now, to understand this kind of a distinction of like what Dupré says versus this, and how he agrees and disagrees with evolutionary psychology, we need to listen to Trent's parable.
Yes, thanks a lot for that stage setting. Um, Here's a parable perhaps would help us to understand the difference between evolutionary psychologists and Dupré. So imagine a house. Inside the house, there's a person living. And the house, of course, it existed in the nature, and the nature happens. Like there's like a storm, whatever, and one day the storm is so strong, the roof is like torn apart, and the water starts to leak. And for evolutionary psychologists, this is like the perfect moment where like human nature manifests itself, basically, because that is that the person miraculously records this to a tool set in which his ancestors accumulated a set of tools like hammers, whatever, and with which that person produces a new roof and to show the water. And so the core of human nature, therefore, is the ability to accumulate new tools in this toolbox and pass it down to the next generation and use it to address and react to natural pressure of evolution or survival. However, for Dupré, this understanding is too simple or misses the point. Instead of a set toolbox that he got transferred across generation, it's really a kind of workshop or as in your language, it's a 3D printer or something, or a way to recognize the situation and change this room with in accord with one's intention and will, and reacting to storm caused damage is just one tiny part of this whole. Sometimes it might not be like pressured from the nature, but sometimes it's just because that person tries to decorate their house, and that thing would have a long-term impact on the way the whole environment that interacts with that person, say spiritual mind, whatever. So what got passed down is that set of, for lack of a better term, perhaps not necessarily tangible knowledge or habits of recognizing situations and act or turn one's ideas or creative impulse into action, and instead of that fixed skill tool. So that's a parable. Would you please like
Yeah,
better connect that with what you just said?
yeah, I think that that parable works well with this kind of a distinction, and I think it's interesting because like the point about the developmental trajectory and the whole point about processes, as I mentioned, Trent also brought forward, what one of the things that it is supposed to do is to supposed to kind of create a context for the trait talk, right? If traits are words, developmental systems are grammar, right? For the lack of better like relation, like they only make sense within this kind of a grammatical world that is about this developmental systems. Now, because of that, uh, Dupré is going to be against this idea of a snapshot of humanity, extract traits, make a list, find them like one-on-one causal links, and just then go home. It's about like understanding where things are heading and where things are coming from, right? So in that sense, like Dupré is challenging Ramsey's approach by kind of turn it into a very broadly speaking, a historical element um, to the whole account. But Dupré's problem with evolutionary psychology is of a different kind, although I think in some ways it gets related to his relationship with Ramsey, because Ramsey is also interested in saying that there is no such a thing as the core, right? Uh, and he is not a reductionist of that kind, that there can be some form of, natural core that culture has nothing to do with. But there are points in Ramsey that seems like that he wants that distinction to exist um, in a way that might cause some issues. And we're going to talk about this later on because we think that the problem is still unresolved even in Dupré and thinkers we're going to talk about in the next episode. But the idea is that when we're thinking about what is a given by nature, um, for evolutionary psychologists, according to Dupré, that's just a thing. That's just a bunch of like given plans or given um, traits that will just unfold, right? They're just predisposed to do certain things because of evolutionary pressures, right? What is, I think, interesting in Dupré's account is that Dupré agrees with the fact that our traits and even developmental trajectories are direct result of evolutionary pressures, right? So that's the agreement that exists between Dupré and evolutionary psychologists. What Dupré has a problem with is that inference of a behavior from a fixed feature of an entity becomes impossible when that fixed feature is, in the case of human being, something plastic like intelligence, right? So this is the point about that workshop versus toolkit part of Trent's parable, that what fixed features that we receive from uh, nature, we shouldn't think about those as these kind of like fixed dispositions that always lead to the same direction. If intelligence and incompleteness of human learning like as an infant is a fixed feature of humanity, or is a statistically prevalent feature of humanity, we shouldn't treat that as like, like a gene unfolding. Like the ability to kind of tap into different learning environments and create different learning environments and emphasize different levels of learning, um, different levels of communication of information, that is not just a gene unfolding. That is something else. And that something else for Dupré is niche construction, which basically means the capacity of organisms to modify their environment and thereby influence their own and other species evolution. Meaning that if you think about a very simplistic vision of gene reductionist approach, that approach would say that here is the trait. The trait is a gene. The gene unfolds. Here, what you get. So if we go back and see what is in our genes and what is the immediate reflection of that in our motivations and behaviors, then you can make sense of everything else based on that, right? And Dupré, in a weird way, might agree with that if you understand that that quote unquote fixed thing is something inherently plastic and variable and incomplete. So there is something incomplete in human nature, which is not just about human nature. Other species do this as well. They change their environment. By their changing environment, they create a new space for themselves. A new space is itself a new quote unquote pressure and opportunity, and that will change their behavior. So it's the difference for someone like Dupré and versus an evolutionary psychologist is that I think for an evolutionary psychologist, there are different social constructions of human forms of communication and learning habits and all of that. Like let's just as a broad term call it like different cultural systems. Um, Whatever those cultural systems are, they are all expressions of the same fixed feature in humanity. So let's forget about the differences between those cultural systems, go to the core, see what are these things examples of, like what are these things are expressing, right? So the cultural differences do not really matter in terms of understanding what a human being is. They're just different manifestations of the same thing. But Dupré disagrees. Like if the cultural system, which is a form of niche construction in the species that we are, is as plastic as Dupré understands it, then if you are born into a learning system that could be institutionalized, non-institutionalized, verbal, non-verbal, communicated in different degrees, then your trajectory, your developmental trajectory is going to be very different from someone else. Of course, this doesn't mean that this is not quote unquote an expression of the same trait, but that the trait is incompleteness. That trait is something like intelligence. That trait is the ability to detach oneself from the immediacy of desires. The trait is the ability to create different learning environments. In that way, yes, you can go back and say that this is all about our ability to kind of create different niche or different environment for ourselves. But that doesn't tell you what human nature is. To understand the human nature, you need all of those specifics because all of these developmental trajectories that come with different cultural axioms have consequences. What is developed in a human being, right? So then this space for culture is going to be very different than someone who thinks that, oh, we're basically just, this is the same nature, these are cultural expressions of the same thing, and you can just like factor them in. They're just an expression of some human feature, right? Which again, as I try to emphasize, is not just a feature of evolutionary psychologists. Something like some Freudian line of thinking will be the same. They're like, this is a civilizing process, right? This is how we become civilized. So therefore, human behavior is always kind of reducible to that core of psychological sexual trauma and response to that. Well, maybe you can say the sexual trauma exists in different cultural systems, but what niche is created based on a response to that creates a developmental trajectory for a group of humanity that is going to be very distinct from another group of humanity, and it becomes a rather moot or vacuous point to say that, oh, but everything is just expression of the same sexual trauma. If the developmental trajectories are taking us to very different, very importantly different places in terms of what we can do and what we can't do, what we express and we don't express, what we experience and we don't experience, then that quote unquote natural core becomes a vacuous general empty statement that, oh, human beings develop, like something like that. That's just like something that is not really, human beings can develop different reactions to their sexuality. Like that is not gonna really tell you much unless you go and see how exactly they have done it differently, what developmental trajectories have become available to humanity in response to that. Then the story is not reductionistic in the way that, in Dupré's view, evolutionary psychologists, or perhaps someone like Freud, want to think. This idea is going to be expounded more by the people we're going to discuss next time, the idea of developmental systems. Before we go there, Trent, any final thoughts on Dupré?
Yes, I just very much in line with what you just said. I can see a lot of value in Dupré's approach towards it, which could shed light on blind spots of Ramsey's approach. One particularly helpful one is precisely what you said. Dupré's difference with perhaps Freud, that, for instance, you can put Freud and Marx in the same room, and I would say everything is reducible to sex-related experiences. The other will say everything is reduced to power related class struggle, whatever. And each would provide a vacuous, in Dupré's eyes, general statement about human nature, and there's no way for you to really evaluate these two general claims because they are both total claims. But with Dupré's processional approach, I think with the concept of niche construction, we can precisely perhaps evaluate such a general statement to see in what cases perhaps like one specific trait leads to or is more central as a more central manifestation of the robust niche construction process of this species compared to another trait. So I think if by introducing a processional approach, we can perhaps even triangulate or correlate previously incompatible general statements about what human beings are. So with that, I think we can wrap this up and
Yeah, just one
Yes.
last thing inspired by what you said, like just putting it a different way because I think it's very much like represents the problem that we had with Hegel on human nature, which is I think for Dupré, if we really understand this point about developmental trajectories, we understand that any kind of like core thing about humanity in terms of given to it by nature um, is itself needs to have a dialectical relationship with the actual ways that developmental trajectories unfold, right? It cannot, the meaning of that, the meaning of the niche construction in humanity cannot be just abstracted from like actual developmental trajectories that human beings have created through niche construction. Like even if we can go ahead and say that like these were the original like behavioral traits that developed in humanity based on some evolutionary pressures, that is not enough to tell you what we are. You see, I think that's the point, and I think in some ways Ramsey agrees with that when he says that how early a trait emerged doesn't tell you how important it is, right? We can go further than that. The same trait that emerged very early on now has a very different meaning based on how it has been developed into different sets or different paths. Um, and I think this is going to be important in understanding the figures that we're going to discuss in the next episodes. So with that, Trent,
Yeah, so with that, we'll conclude this episode. So, dear listeners, thanks for following us, and please stay attuned. Our next episode, we're going to discuss Griffiths and Stott's developmental framework towards human nature. Thanks much for your listening.